We're in Chris Hoggett's studio in Cheltenham, and we're discussing this book, The Joker, which is a representation of Chris's work over the period of about 20 years, where he addressed the problem of manic depression through art. And we could start the discussion, Chris, by talking about the image which has become very iconic in your work, the childhood of the Joker. Would you like to tell us how that came about?
Well, yes. I'll start by saying I was 10 years old and found myself in the predicament of not being able to go to the toilet. And so I was taken into hospital, and it was presumably to be for a few weeks. It ended up in 12 weeks. And I was dealt with and it was cleared up. However, the emotional aspects of it were very powerful, very strong. The emotion of feelings. One mainly because in those days, now going back to the 30s, parents were not allowed to visit more than once a week, usually on a Sunday afternoon, for an hour or perhaps a little longer. And that added to the feeling of isolation. So I showed the image of the mother in the distance walking away up here, and the child enclosed in the cot. Well, that was the first sketch, but somehow it wasn't satisfactory in itself. It needed to be taken further. So I moved on to another image, which is under here. We see quite a lot of the original image is still intact. The posture of the figure is exactly the same. The outline of the cot has been slightly modified, but it's still visible in a few of the bars. The mother has been picked out more strongly. The path remains.
Here, this is a much more complex form.
Absolutely,
and
yes.
This seems to be a recurring theme in the development of your work. So, can you tell us something about the transition from the simple to the complex form and how that is related to the whole question of trauma that you were talking about earlier?
Well, I've always had a strong feeling for space, Pat, in work, and I think you have to have a centre point, a focal point for all one's work. In this case, it was the head. The head is very broad here. In this image, it's been reduced and it's been made into a nose. So I was looking for something more. I was looking for some sort of comfort element. By which I mean, the moment I've decided that the head was a nose and the trees have become the outline hair of a skull, I've found if you like, the metaphor of my comfort zone.
And there's this whole notion of comfort being derived through art, through representation through art. Is that the therapeutic process itself?
I think this is the artistic approach to finding an explanation of what one is about, what one is trying to say or find or comfort, whatever it might be. We're trying to paint something that feels well, I'm talking as a romantic. It's about feeling and intuition, much more than a much dry, not a conceptual idea at all, but a very emotional approach. That's my approach to it.
Yeah.
This has not anything to do with the Joker, but it shows an image of a man upside down, standing on his head, with his feet in the air. And it's from a poem about being tired of this quest for enlightenment. It's a sort of Buddhist approach that he doesn't any longer believe in anything outside the real world. But so when he dies, he's going to put his head into the ground, his hands there, and roots will grow down, his body will stand up, and birds will settle, and squirrels will settle, and he'll become a tree of life. It's a transformative image.
Earlier, this is a much more alarming image.
Yes,
yeah.
Very disturbing. If you're in a very bad depressive state, you tend to get nervous and anxious, and there's a certain amount of fluttering within, palpitations. And I wanted to represent the palpitations, and immediately the thought came to mind that the fluttering, the word flutter, put birds into my mind immediately. So I'm being invaded by birds. I've decided on that title. And the birds are not only in the chest and area, they begin to get up into the head and so on. And I quote in the book to the fact that I had to be very still and ask them to quieten down, which is what happened.
And perhaps we can see in this next example that we're going to look at how you've actually brought that very much as a focus on self, this self-portrait.
I'd like to say for a start that this is what I call automatic drawing. This is where you switch off one's reasonable aspects, one's things, and get into that state somewhere between the area of dream and reality. You switch off thinking and you just let a brush trail over the surface. Because I didn't intend to make a face, not to begin with. I just doodled, and I suddenly found that a hand of sorts and a moustache of sorts had appeared. But what was more interesting, and we often do this in this kind of work, turn it sideways, and you find another image has appeared. A bird, and something that could be a bird, but hasn't quite become so. So then I saw it as a black and a white bird. That has its own story.
How would Jung describe this? As something coming out of the subconscious, the unconscious? It's
certainly the subconscious area. Yes. The side perhaps we want
it is remarkable, isn't it? Looking at that image now and seeing so clearly that dialogue between the light and the dark bird embedded within what originally started as a self-portrait.
Nevertheless, you have to do a little bit of tickling. You see, you can't call that a bird at the moment. It's because I was thinking in those terms that I just with a few strokes I turned it into that. Yeah. And that happens a lot in art. You have to do a few modifications.
Well, here we have a much more profound representation of movement in the image that you've called free fall. Yeah. And it's a theme which recurs in a lot of your images, this cascading, almost disembodied form that recurs. Tell us what's behind that.
Well, this is the opening of a serious breakdown, perhaps the really biggest breakdown I had some 20 years ago. I was sitting at a table, taking up some notes, and I sort of lost touch with something. I couldn't account for it really, but I did feel myself with a sort of wave of mild nausea and possibly a fainting off. All I could remember was I was floating from the chair, it slipped backwards, and I indicate that by the angle of the chair there. And then I lost it. I just started to fall to the floor. And as I write in the book, there's a reference to the card sharp, the chap who flicks a pack of cards across. And it felt exactly like that, moving across from one place to another and landing not on the solid floor, but looking into a hole. There seemed to be an endlessly black pit beneath. And that was very unnerving indeed.
But there is also, in a sense, a reverse in restoring you back to this condition. Is the painting representative? Is the painting part of that process?
So I put it slightly differently. Obviously, I've got to get up from the floor. I've got to go back. So, of course, one got up. One didn't go back to the table. One went out of the room. So that was the next painting. And I did a series of 4 paintings, some of which occur in the book, as you know. That took a long time, a lot of painting and drawing to find any way through.
Chris, in the few minutes we've had to talk about your work, we've only touched very briefly on a few of the themes. But the book itself contains almost 600 images, all illustrated with this beautiful cursive script that you've got, your handwritten script to illustrate them. And all of the themes that we've talked about and many more are represented in the book. So, for example, if I just open at random, we see, for example, movement and image within image, all of those themes coming out. But the book is arranged thematically, and it actually tells the story both in the images and in the text that you've written. It's a self-contained journey through 20 years of engagement with this whole process of therapeutic process of recovery. Apart from being, in my view, a most wonderful chronicle of profound artwork.